There are moments in a public life that arrive with the quiet inevitability of a verdict long delayed. What happened to Barack Obama last week, the visible disorientation, the lost place in the speech, the long pause that the cameras caught and the editors could not cut around, none of it surprises me, not one bit. Because when a man spends the better part of 2 decades being told he is the smartest person in any room he enters, when he builds an entire public identity around the performance of eloquence and command, eventually the performance has to hold up under conditions he cannot control. And when it doesn't, when the teleprompter glitches and the room goes silent and the great orator stands there looking, for the first time in public memory, like a man who isn't sure where he is, the spell breaks. It doesn't matter how many presidential libraries you've raised money for, how many Netflix deals you've signed, how many magazine covers have called you the conscience of your generation. The image either survives the moment or it doesn't. And last week, in front of millions of viewers, the image did not survive. Something is wrong. Anyone watching with honest eyes could see it, and the carefully managed silence from the people around him in the days since tells you everything about how seriously his own circle is taking what they witnessed. Let's go back, because to understand the significance of what happened on that stage, you have to understand where the cracks in this carefully managed public persona first began to show. June 2011, the White House East Room, a Medal of Honor ceremony for a fallen Army Ranger. Obama, then in the middle of his first term, stood at the podium and delivered a tribute to the soldiers' service. And in the middle of the speech, he said the words. He thanked the 10th Mountain Division for their bravery. There was just one problem. The soldier had not served in the 10th Mountain Division. He had served in the 75th Ranger Regiment. The error sat there in the official transcript for hours before the White House quietly corrected it. The fallen soldier's family heard the wrong unit named at the ceremony honoring their son. And the press, which would have devoured any other president for that mistake, treated it as a footnote, a small slip in an otherwise moving address. But the people who noticed, noticed. The veterans' community noticed. The military families noticed. And those of us who were paying attention noticed something deeper. We noticed that the man at the podium, the man celebrated for the precision of his oratory, had delivered a tribute to a dead soldier without knowing the most basic fact about that soldier's service. He had read the words. He had performed the grief, but he had not done the work. That was the tell. That was the moment captured on the official White House video feed that should have prompted a serious reassessment of what we were actually watching every time Barack Obama stepped up to a microphone. A man who was extraordinarily gifted at sounding informed and considerably less gifted at being informed. A performer first and a substance man somewhere distantly behind. The press let it go. They always let it go. And so the legend grew, unchallenged, for another decade and a half, until last week, when the performance itself finally faltered. Now I want you to think about how this has been covered in the days since, or really, how it hasn't been. The clip, the moment from last week's appearance, went viral within hours. Tens of millions of views across platforms. Ordinary people watched it and saw what they saw. A man losing his place. A man trailing off in the middle of a sentence. A man staring at his notes for what felt like an eternity before an aide stepped forward to help. And the response from the legacy press? Silence. Or worse, active management. The major outlets ran no significant coverage. The fact-checking operations, which exist in theory to bring clarity to disputed claims, were nowhere to be found. A handful of sympathetic commentators dismissed the moment as a glitch, a stumble, the kind of thing that happens to anyone. As if the rest of us had not just spent 5 years being told that every similar moment from a different politician was definitive evidence of decline. The double standard was so brazen it was almost insulting. The same media class that built an entire genre of content around scrutinizing the speech patterns and physical mobility of Joe Biden, the same media class that ran days of segments on Donald Trump's word choices and gait, looked at the Obama clip and decided collectively that there was nothing to see. Well, the American people are getting an honest accounting now, because no amount of institutional protection can suppress a video that millions of people have already watched with their own eyes. And what they saw was not pretty. Let's talk about the carefully constructed legacy, because his defenders love that word. The legacy of dignity, the legacy of intellect, as if the repetition itself is an argument. What is the actual record examined without the soft lighting his media protectors have always provided? He was, throughout his presidency, celebrated for an eloquence that, when you go back and listen to the speeches outside the moments his speechwriters had crafted in advance, frequently dissolved into the kind of meandering filler that any honest editor would have cut. The famous interviews where he searched for words, the press conferences where simple questions produced lengthy non-answers, the off-the-cuff remarks that needed cleanup statements from the press office the following morning. These were not the work of a master communicator. They were the work of a man who relied, more than any modern president, on the apparatus around him to make him sound like the figure his admirers wanted him to be. And on the questions of substance, the same pattern held. He promised that if you liked your doctor, you could keep your doctor. That sentence alone, repeated dozens of times in dozens of venues, should have been the end of his credibility as a careful speaker, because it wasn't a misstatement. It wasn't a stray comment. It was a deliberate, repeated, documented assurance, delivered to the American people to sell a piece of legislation that could not pass on its actual merits. Beyond the rhetoric, what's left? A foreign policy record that includes the chaotic withdrawal he set in motion in Iraq, the red line in Syria that he drew and then walked away from while the world watched, the Libya intervention that produced a failed state and an embassy attack that his administration spent weeks publicly blaming on a YouTube video. The Iran deal that was structured to bypass the Senate because he could not have ratified it through constitutional means. The Paris Climate Agreement, same structure, same workaround, same contempt for the legislative process. That is not a legacy of dignified governance. That is a record of a man who governed by press release because the harder work was beyond his interest, his attention span, or his coalition. And then there is the human cost, which is the part of this story that the celebratory documentaries never reach. The collateral damage that nobody in the Obama orbit has ever been willing to examine honestly. Under his leadership, the Democratic Party suffered the most catastrophic electoral collapse of any party under any president in the modern era. More than 1,000 legislative seats lost, governorships handed away, the House gone, the Senate gone, state parties gutted in the very regions, the upper Midwest, the rural South, the working-class counties of Pennsylvania and Ohio, where the party had been competitive for generations. The people who paid for that collapse were not the Obamas, who moved seamlessly into a post-presidency of production deals and beachfront properties. The people who paid were the working Democrats who had to run for office in those districts after their national leader had spent 8 years signaling through policy and through cultural posture that their concerns were beneath him. The auto workers in Michigan, the coal families in West Virginia, the factory towns in Ohio whose plants closed during his presidency and whose anguish was met with lectures about clinging to guns and religion. They rendered their verdict in November 2016. They rendered it again in 2024. And the man who broke their party walked away from the wreckage to be photographed kitesurfing with billionaires, his approval rating intact only because the press refused, then as now, to assign him any meaningful share of the responsibility. Now let's talk about what has emerged in the weeks before last week's stage moment, because the timing here is not incidental. In early April of 2026, a fresh tranche of documents was released as part of the ongoing Justice Department review of the intelligence assessments produced in the final weeks of the Obama administration. The materials include internal communications, draft assessments, and notations from senior officials regarding the construction of the January 2017 Intelligence Community Assessment on Russian interference. What the documents reveal, in the judgment of multiple analysts who have reviewed them, is a process in which professional dissent was sidelined, in which contrary evidence was downplayed, and in which the final product was shaped by political considerations its own drafters privately acknowledged. A whistleblower, a former senior analyst with more than 20 years of service, has now provided sworn testimony to a Senate committee describing the pressure she experienced during that period. Her account, portions of which were released this month, describes meetings in which her objections were noted and dismissed, drafts in which her language was edited beyond recognition, and a final document she has stated, under oath, she does not believe reflects the honest professional judgment of the analysts who built it. Now I want to be precise, because precision matters in a matter this serious. Some commentators have argued that the analytical disagreements documented in the new materials fall within the normal range of intelligence community deliberation, and that no individual document conclusively establishes intent to deceive. Fine, that is a legitimate point as far as it goes. But here is what it does not change. The cumulative documentary record, now substantially more complete than it was even a year ago, describes an administration that placed its political interests above its institutional obligations in the final weeks of its tenure. The Justice Department has expanded the scope of its review. Congressional committees have scheduled additional hearings. The man whose name appears in the chain of approval at the top of those documents is the same man who stood on a stage last week and could not, for a long and excruciating moment, find his way back to the script. Whatever else is happening with him, the timing of these revelations is unlikely to be helping. And the pattern matters here, because what happened on that stage last week is not a single moment. It runs through the entire arc of the Obama post-presidency like a thread. You saw it in the steadily diminishing public appearances, the events that used to draw mass audiences now scheduled in smaller venues with friendlier formats. You saw it in the increasingly tightly managed interviews, the questions submitted in advance, the topics restricted to comfortable ground, the production values cranked higher to compensate for content that no longer carries on its own. You saw it in the abandoned podcast experiment with his wife, the show that was supposed to be the centerpiece of the Higher Ground production deal, the show that quietly disappeared from the release schedule after underperforming and was eventually shelved without ceremony. You saw it in the Presidential Center on the south side of Chicago, the project that was supposed to be open by 2021 and is now, more than 4 years behind schedule and hundreds of millions of dollars over its original budget, still not complete. Each of these is, on its own, manageable. Cumulatively, they describe the steady contraction of a public figure whose carefully managed mystique can no longer be sustained against the gravitational pull of his actual performance. Here is the thing about Barack Obama that I think his most devoted admirers have never been willing to confront honestly. The gap between the rhetoric and the reality was not incidental. It was not the product of a hostile opposition or an unfair press. It was structural. It was the defining feature of the man from the beginning. He was a person of extraordinary gifts in the narrow domain of describing the world he wished existed, and he was a person of considerably more modest gifts in the much larger domain of actually working to bring that world into being. The presidency exposed this gap in policy. The post-presidency has been exposing it in production, and last week's stage moment exposed it in the most elemental terms imaginable on the level of basic public competence. There is no better physical monument to all of this than the unfinished tower rising over Jackson Park on the south side of Chicago. The Obama Presidential Center, years behind schedule, hundreds of millions of dollars over budget, surrounded, even now, by construction fencing that has been there so long that the neighborhood organizations originally promised partnership have given up on attending the community meetings. The building does not even house his presidential papers. They are digital, accessed remotely, stored elsewhere. The structure is, in the most literal architectural sense, a monument with nothing in it. A 225-foot tower commemorating a presidency whose actual records are kept off-site, in a different state, by a different institution. Local residents have spent years describing the displacement the project has caused, the rents rising, the families priced out of the neighborhood the center was supposed to lift. Community elders, many of whom voted for Obama twice, have spoken publicly about feeling betrayed by the project that bears his name. If you wanted a metaphor for the entire Obama phenomenon, the announcement that always exceeded the delivery, the symbol that always outran the substance, the promise that always cost the people it claimed to serve, You could not do better than that fenced-off tower on the south side. Now, I want to pause here and address something directly. In the days since the stage moment, a particularly ugly strain of online content has emerged, including doctored images and degrading jokes targeting the former president and members of his family in personal and physical terms. Some of it has crossed into territory that no public figure, regardless of record, should have to see attached to their name. It is wrong. Full stop. I can believe that Barack Obama's record deserves the kind of rigorous reassessment it never received from the press that protected him for 8 years. I can document the failures of that record with specificity, and I can still say without hesitation that the man and his family deserve to be treated with the basic dignity owed to any human being. Those two things are not in conflict. They are, in fact, required to coexist if anyone wants to maintain the moral standing to make the larger argument. The people circulating the cruder material are not advancing the cause of honest accountability. They are handing his defenders the easiest possible deflection, allowing the conversation to pivot from substance to outrage. Decency is not selective. It applies to the people we have spent years criticizing. It applies always. I want to address something else directly because I know how these conversations get framed. Asking honest questions about what we all watched on that stage last week is not about partisan grievance. It is not about hatred. It is not about being some bitter critic unable to accept the brilliance of a transformational figure. That lazy framing the legacy press deployed for 15 years to shut down every legitimate inquiry. For those of us who have watched this public career with clear eyes from the beginning, the issue has always been about evidence, about whether the public figure being celebrated matches the public figure being observed. The evidence is now overwhelming. The clip, the silence around the clip, the documents from the intelligence review, the unfinished tower, the abandoned podcast, the shrinking venues, the visibly contracting public presence, all of it points in the same direction. The irony of history, and history is full of ironies, is that Barack Obama's own post-presidency, his own choices about how to spend the years after the office, has done more to clarify the actual scale of the man than any of his critics could have managed. The production deals under-delivered. The book sales fell off after the first volume. The promised second volume of the presidential memoir has been quietly pushed back, again, with no firm release date. The political endorsements he has issued in recent cycles have repeatedly failed to move the races he intervened in. The advisory role he was supposed to play within the Democratic Party has produced, on examination, very little that the party's actual operatives credit him for. He was given every conceivable advantage, a press corps that worshipped him, supermajorities in his first 2 years, a Nobel Prize awarded before he had done anything to earn it, which even the committee later acknowledged was premature. A country that wanted desperately for him to succeed. He squandered the gift, not because the opposition was too organized, presidents face organized opposition, not because the challenges were too great, presidents face great challenges, but because the gap between his self-conception and his actual capacities was too vast to be bridged by any speechwriting team, any production deal, any architectural monument. He believed in his own legend more than he believed in the hard work of being equal to it. And when the legend collided with the moment on that stage last week, the moment won. The moment always wins, eventually. That June 2011 Medal of Honor ceremony was the first warning sign. The man who could deliver the cadence of a tribute without knowing the unit of the soldier he was honoring. It took the rest of the country a long time to catch up, but the reckoning has arrived, and it was, as it turns out, inevitable. You cannot build a public life on the performance of mastery and hope that no one ever checks the substance. Someone always checks the substance. And the bill, the full accounting of what Barack Obama was, what he actually did, and what he is now becoming as the protections fall away, is coming due in front of millions of viewers, on stages he can no longer fully control. History will not remember him the way his supporters hoped. It will remember him the way the evidence demands.